The first thing I want you to understand, before we get into the meat of this, is that this isn't one of those over-dramatized internet myths. The technique I'm about to walk you through was a very real, very intentional survival method used by Norse settlers in Greenland and northern Scandinavia. It was suppressed not because it was mystical, but because it was dangerously effective and created a tactical imbalance between communities. For the next minute, I want you locked in, because once you know the logic behind the Silent Viking technique, you'll recognize why both chieftains and later church authorities discouraged it from being passed down. They feared what happened when ordinary herders and fishermen learned how to move, hunt, and relocate without leaving a trace. And if you've spent time studying how Norse societies adapted to harsher climates, you know that any method that guaranteed advantage in territory control became politically sensitive fast. Now let's set the scene and walk into what the technique actually was, how it worked, and why every modern prepper should understand it. There's a reason this remains one of the most efficient low-visibility movement systems ever recorded. The Silent Viking technique was a method of movement designed to make an entire group invisible in open Arctic terrain. Arctic settlers didn't have forests dense enough to hide in, nor did they have soft ground that could swallow footprints the way temperate mud does. They lived on wind-scraped plateaus, gravel plains, and frozen crust where a single misstep could leave a mark readable from 50 meters away. The Silent Viking technique solved this by teaching individuals to use wind direction, ground texture, and staggered movement to erase any sign of passage. Hunters used it to approach wary prey, but it became more than that. It became a tactical mobility trick that allowed entire families to relocate camps without a neighboring clan knowing which route they had taken. In practice, the method relied first on reading the snow. Arctic snow rarely lies smooth. It forms into what the Norse called skafrenning, ridged windswept waves. A person walking normally would compress the snow between the ridges, leaving darkened grooves. But a person trained in the technique would step only on the hardened crests where the wind had already compacted the surface. When done correctly, even a large man wearing fur boots could move across a field without leaving a visible track. If you want to apply this today, the principle remains exactly the same. On any landscape shaped by wind, whether dunes, sandbars, crusted snow, or loose scree, you move on the hardened lines created by the wind itself, never in the troughs. The environment erases your pressure instead of retaining it. The second layer of the technique taught settlers how to use wind drift to erase the little evidence they might still leave. Arctic winds move low and fast, carrying ice dust that resettles constantly. If the walker positioned themselves so the wind hit their back or their flank, the drifting snow would fill whatever faint impressions remained behind them. This required precise timing. Hunters practiced walking in rhythm with gusts, advancing when the wind surged and freezing when it died. If you want to experiment with this today, start by practicing in sandy or snowy terrain. You take a step only when a gust is strong enough to visibly scatter loose material. That gust becomes your camouflage. It keeps whatever trace you leave from becoming permanent. The third component of the Silent Viking technique involved traveling in a broken, non-linear formation that confused distance tracking. Instead of a straight line or typical spread-out group, the Arctic Norse traveled as a shifting file, never more than 2 or 3 visible at once, with others temporarily veering off to follow separate wind-crusted paths before folding back in. Anyone attempting to track them would find fragments of routes but no unified trail. This made raiding parties extremely hard to stalk and settlers hard to ambush. Even today, when you're trying to avoid being followed, whether in wilderness travel or in any environment where you don't want your path easily read, this method holds up. Move in segments, break formation every few minutes and rejoin from different angles. You don't need to be in the Arctic for this to work. The principle is about fragmentation, not snow. The technique also included a silence discipline rooted in breath control. You've probably come across this in other cultures' hunting traditions, but the Arctic Norse formalized it. When moving in cold air, exhalations produce a cloud that can be seen at a distance. They trained themselves to push each breath down through the throat and release it slowly, close to the body, so the heat signature diffused instead of blooming outward. It wasn't mystical. It was physics. A group practicing this discipline could move across a frozen field at dawn without giving away a single plume of vapor. If you want to try this practically, train yourself to exhale through partially closed lips, letting the air escape, gradually. In cold conditions, you'll see the vapor cloud shrink immediately. Why the settlers were later ordered never to teach it again comes down to power, not danger. The church reforms in Greenland and Iceland during the late medieval period aimed to centralize authority. Mobility without trace meant independence, the ability to disappear, the ability to raid or escape, taxation or levies. Skills that once kept families alive suddenly made them politically inconvenient. By the 14th century, formal teaching of the technique had largely been suppressed, preserved only in fragments of oral tradition. And here's the important part for you as a prepper and historian. This wasn't magic, and it wasn't legend. It was environmental literacy turned into movement discipline. You can apply every piece of it today if you understand why each element worked. The Silent Viking Technique is a masterclass in reading terrain, syncing with natural forces and controlling your acoustic and visual signature without gear. If you found this deep dive useful, and you want more long-form historical breakdowns like this, make sure you subscribe to Warfield Prepper Chronicles and share this video with someone who appreciates serious history as much as you do.